The laughter started before Honoria Calvert had set down her teacup. She was sitting near the window of Stanbrook's drawing room on a June afternoon, her work basket open beside her, her attention apparently given to a length of linen she was hemming, when her sister Adelaide turned toward the assembled guests with a particular brightness she reserved for performances. The room was warm and crowded. A neighbor's engagement was to be announced within the hour, and Adelaide had found her moment. She gestured toward Honoria with the fond, pitying tilt of the head that had become, over 3 years, as practiced as any stage direction. "Imagine," she said to the room, "refusing a duke, not turning down a farmer or a clergyman with poor prospects, but an actual duke, and then spending the next 3 years tending weeds and grinding herbs past the age of 35, as though solitude were a vocation one chose deliberately." The room obliged her with laughter, warm and comfortable, the laughter of people who have heard a joke enough times to feel they own it. Honoria set her teacup down without a tremor. She looked up at no one in particular and remarked, pleasantly, that the chamomile had come in beautifully this year. She expected an excellent harvest. Then she returned her eyes to the linen and continued her hemming. On the far side of the drawing room, standing at a slight remove from the guests nearest the window, Marcus Carlyle, Duke of Wexcombe, watched this. He had not been expected. He had arrived in the county 2 days prior on a matter of business with the Hargrove family, Stanbrook's nearest neighbors. And Mrs. Hargrove, in the warmth of her hospitality, had extended the invitation that brought him here. He had accepted without considering that Honoria Calvert would be present. He had not, in truth, considered her very much at all since the afternoon 3 years ago when she had refused him in plain terms and left a room that still felt, in memory, slightly airless. He considered her now. She had not flinched. She had not colored. She had not sent a single glance toward her sister that carried either hurt or reproach. She had made her small remark about the chamomile, dry, entirely self-possessed, almost amusing, and gone back to her work as though the joke had been directed at someone else entirely. The room had laughed and moved on, and she was already somewhere else in her attention, the needle moving steadily through the linen, her profile still and composed in the afternoon light. Marcus found that he was looking at a woman who had just absorbed a public cruelty with a composure so complete it looked like indifference. And he could not determine, with any of the certainty he usually trusted in himself, whether the composure was armor or simply who she was. The engagement announcement drew the room together in a press of congratulations and exclamations. And in the movement of the crowd, Marcus found himself closer to Honoria than the room's geography had previously permitted. The guests surged forward. She was jostled from one side, and he put his hand briefly at her elbow to steady her. It was the gesture of a moment, the automatic courtesy of any man who found a woman off balance beside him, and it required nothing. But his hand remained at her elbow 1 instant beyond the moment that courtesy required, not long enough for anyone to observe it, barely long enough for him to be conscious of having done it. And then he released her and stepped back. Honoria did not look at him directly, but he saw the small adjustment she made. Not away from him, not toward him, simply a stillness. The particular stillness of someone registering a sensation they had not expected. He thought, watching her return her attention to the room, that she was a woman whom almost no one touched anymore. That the joke had done that, among other things. That her family had laughed, and he had been standing across the room, and for the first time since the afternoon she had refused him. He felt with uncomfortable clarity that he had read something badly wrong. 3 years before that June afternoon, Marcus Carlyle had proposed marriage to Lady Honoria Calvert in the formal drawing room at Stanbrook on a Tuesday in early spring. It had been a considered proposal, made in good faith, between two people of comparable rank and compatible situation. He was a widower of 41, without children, in possession of a substantial estate and a title that required no elaboration. She was 38, the eldest daughter of the late Earl of Stanbrook, still unmarried in a household of 4 daughters, and his estate lay close enough to hers that the match had been discussed by their respective families with something approaching inevitability. He had not been in love with her. He would not have claimed that. But he had respected her, had found her company agreeable on the occasions they had shared it, and had believed the match a sensible and decent one. She had refused him in 3 sentences. She had not been unkind. She had offered no explanation, no softening qualification, no expression of regret that carried any warmth. She had simply said that she was grateful for the honor, that she could not accept, and that she hoped he would not find the refusal a source of difficulty between their families. Then she had risen from her chair and left the room. He had sat for a moment alone with the silence, and then he too had left, and he had ridden back to Wexcombe with the particular sensation of a man who believed himself a good judge of character, and had just been presented with evidence to the contrary. The family's response had hardened rapidly into something less forgiving than his own. They had witnessed the refusal from the hallway. Adelaide and Frances, the 2 middle sisters, had been close enough to the door to catch its shape, if not its words. And the story that formed in the days afterward was one in which Honoria had simply refused, without cause, a man of the first respectability, apparently from some private conviction of her own superiority. The story was never spoken in quite those terms, but it lived in every inflection of Adelaide's voice when she returned to the subject, which she did with the regularity of a woman who had found a story that served her well. What no one in that hallway had seen was the conversation that had taken place 3 days before the proposal. Lavinia, the youngest of the 4 sisters, then 26, pretty and quick and prone to feeling things with a completeness that she had never learned to conceal, had come to Honoria's room late on a Thursday evening in a state that Honoria had recognized immediately as the state of someone carrying something too heavy to carry alone. She had sat on the edge of the bed and had told her eldest sister in pieces that she was in love with Marcus Carlyle, that she had been in love with him for the better part of a year, and that and here Lavinia had stopped and had pressed her hands together in her lap and had continued, that he had expressed to her, in terms that could not be misread, that the feeling was returned. He said nothing to you directly? Honoria had asked. He could not, Lavinia had said. Not while everyone expected. Not while you were the expected match. He is too honorable for that. And so am I, or I am trying to be. But I could not let you accept without knowing. Honoria had sat with this for a long time after Lavinia had gone back to her room. She had understood the mechanics of it immediately. The eldest daughter of Stanbrook was the expected match, and no honorable man would begin a courtship of the youngest while the eldest stood in that position. The path was blocked. The only way to clear it was to refuse him, and to refuse him in terms that left no door open, so that the family's disappointment would fall entirely on her, and not give anyone cause to look for another explanation. She had done it. She had done it cleanly, without leaving Lavinia's name anywhere near the room, and she had absorbed what followed without once offering a word in her own defense, because the only defense available to her was the one she had chosen not to use. Lavinia had married Marcus's close friend, Lord Beaumont, 8 months later. A match that had formed with a swiftness that suggested both parties had been waiting for something to resolve itself, and had been living quietly and happily in Devonshire ever since. The family had never connected these events. Adelaide and Frances had never had reason to. Marcus, riding home from Stanbrook on that June evening, found that he could not stop thinking about a woman who had remarked on the chamomile harvest and gone back to her hemming while a room full of people laughed at her. He told himself, in the days that followed, that the business with the Hargroves required a second visit. He told himself this with sufficient conviction that he almost believed it, and he made the second visit, and found himself at the end of it, turning his horse not toward the road to Wexcombe, but along the lane that ran past the south wall of Stanbrook's kitchen garden. He had heard from Mrs. Hargrove that Honoria Calvert supplied remedies to several of the local families. His household at Wexcombe included 3 elderly servants, whose various complaints had resisted every remedy he had thus far procured. It was a practical inquiry, nothing more. Honoria received him in the distillery, a converted outbuilding at the back of the kitchen garden, smelling of dried lavender and something sharper and green that he could not name. With the expression of a woman who had correctly identified the pretext for what it was and had decided to allow it anyway. She showed him the shelves of labeled jars without any of the performance he had expected. She named the plants and their uses in the same tone she might have used to discuss a ledger, precise and without ornament. When he asked a question that revealed his ignorance, she answered it directly rather than diplomatically. When he asked a question that was actually intelligent, she paused before answering, which told him she had noticed. "The complaint you describe," she said, studying a row of jars, "is almost certainly the same inflammation my neighbor Mr. Tibbs has been managing since February. I can make up something that will help if your man will collect it at the end of the week." "I would rather come myself," Marcus said. Honoria lifted a jar, examined its contents, and set it back on the shelf. "Yes," she said. "I expect you would." He came the following week, and the week after that. Adelaide and Francis watched his reappearance with expressions that shifted, over the course of July, from surprise to suspicion, to something that looked, when they thought no one was observing them, like unease. A duke returning to Stanbrook 3 times in as many weeks was either a man come to gloat or a man come to court. And if it was the latter, they watched his attention with the particular attention of women who needed to determine which sister he was considering. When the attention settled consistently on Honoria, they began to say things. The things were said in the way Adelaide had always said them, with affection on the surface and a blade beneath it, in rooms with other people present, in tones that invited the listener to share the joke. She told a visitor one afternoon that Honoria's remedies appeared to require an extraordinary dedication to the follow-up consultation. She said it with a smile. The visitor smiled back. Honoria, who was in the room, continued grinding dried rosemary in the small mortar she had brought indoors. She did not look up. On a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of July, a summer storm came in from the west, without much warning. Marcus had walked with Honoria along the path that ran near the parish churchyard. She had been checking on a grave marker she had commissioned for a village woman who had died in the spring. And the rain arrived as they were returning, fast and heavy. The kind that soaked through a coat in under a minute. Marcus removed his coat and dropped it over Honoria's shoulders without asking permission. "That is entirely unnecessary," Honoria said. "Yes," Marcus agreed, and continued walking. She stood for a moment in the rain with his coat around her shoulders and looked at his back. And then she decided that carrying it would be more trouble than wearing it. And she wore it. It was warm and it smelled of horses and some kind of cedar preparation. And she was aware of it the entire way back to the garden gate in a way that she found inconvenient. The distillery on a late afternoon in August had the particular quality of amber light that came from a single lamp set low on the work table, and Honoria was cataloging a set of pressed specimens. Flat, papery things mounted on card and labeled in her small, exact hand. Marcus had arrived on the pretext of collecting a preparation she had made for his head groundskeeper, and the collection had extended, by mutual unspoken agreement, into the kind of conversation that had become their habit over the summer. Practical on the surface, entirely attentive underneath. She held up a specimen, a sprig of something pale, its Latin name written along the stem, and turned it toward the lamp. "The veining is unusual," she said. "I collected it near the western wall in June, and I have not been able to find another." Marcus reached across and took her hand to angle it more directly toward the light. He turned her hand slowly, ostensibly to examine the leaf. The leaf did not require the amount of time he took to examine it. He held her hand a moment longer than the examination required, not gripping, simply holding, and then released it without comment, and looked at the specimen, and said that the veining was, indeed, unusual. Neither of them mentioned it. He had been thinking, over the course of the summer, about a woman who did not defend herself. Not out of weakness. He had understood that much within the first week of their conversations. Her intelligence was precise and unsentimental. She had opinions she expressed without apology when asked for them, and she occasionally expressed them without being asked, which he had come to find he preferred. She was not passive. She was not resigned. She simply did not spend herself on attacks she had apparently decided were beneath a response. He had also been thinking about the refusal. He had been thinking about it differently than he had thought about it for 3 years, turning it over with new eyes, examining what he actually knew against what he had assumed. What he actually knew was, she had refused him, offered no explanation, and had spent the years since absorbing her family's contempt without offering a single word to correct their understanding of what had happened. People who were simply proud did not behave that way. People who had refused a duke out of arrogance did not sit quietly while their sisters made a public joke of the refusal in front of the man they had refused. They either gloated or they grew defensive. They did not remark on the chamomile and go back to their work. At a small gathering at Stanbrook one afternoon in late August, a handful of neighbors, tea in the drawing room, Adelaide made her remark about the ducal site visits. She said it brightly, with her head tilted toward the assembled company, inviting them to consider whether it was the herbs or the herbalist that kept drawing Wexcombe back to Stanbrook. The room's attention shifted briefly toward Honoria. Marcus was in the room. He did not validate the remark with a laugh. He did not offer Adelaide the social rescue of a light response that would have let the moment pass as harmless teasing. He simply looked at her with an expression that Adelaide, he could see, had not expected. Not angry, not amused, simply measuring. And then he looked away. Riding toward Wexcombe that afternoon, he turned over what the full summer had shown him. A woman of precise and capable intelligence, who absorbed every cruelty without the cost of her composure, who had never once, across dozens of conversations in the distillery, in the garden, and the churchyard path, given him a single reason to believe that her refusal had been contempt. He thought, there is something here I have not understood. He thought, I have been wrong about what happened in that room 3 years ago. He thought, I do not yet know the shape of the wrong, but I am beginning to see its edges. It was the paper that showed him. He had come to the distillery on a Wednesday morning in September, and Honoria was pressing specimens, arranging dried plant material between sheets of paper and weighting them with flat stones from the garden wall. The paper she was using had been folded and refolded, its surface slightly soft with handling. And as she smoothed it beneath a sprig of dried meadowsweet, the sheet shifted and opened. Marcus saw the handwriting. He recognized it immediately. He had seen it in notes passed at the Beaumont table, in letters Lavinia had written to mutual acquaintances that had occasionally passed through his hands. The loops were distinctive, slightly forward-leaning, the capital L made in a particular way that he would have known anywhere. Honoria did not see him find it. She was reaching for another stone, her back half turned, and he looked at the sheet for 3 seconds. Long enough to see the salutation, long enough to understand that it was a letter to Honoria from Lavinia, and that it was old, its ink slightly faded. And then Honoria turned back, and the paper was beneath the specimen, and the stone was placed on top of it. Marcus said nothing. He accepted the preparation she had made for his groundskeeper. He answered the question she asked about how the man's knee had been progressing, and he rode back to Wexcombe in a state that was not quite thought and not quite feeling, but something between the two. Something with the quality of a structure being re-examined from the foundation. The refusal. The silence. The 3 years of public ridicule she had never corrected. The family's contempt she had absorbed without once offering a defense that, it was now clear to him, she could have offered if she had chosen to. She had chosen not to. She had chosen, deliberately, to remain the household's cautionary story, the eldest daughter who refused a duke and had nothing to show for it, because the only explanation available to her would have named her sister. He sat with this for a long time after he arrived home. That same night, a boy from the village was brought to Honoria's door. The child was 8 years old and had been under her care since the previous winter for a chest complaint that had improved but never fully resolved. He arrived in the arms of his father, burning with fever, his breathing the wrong kind of shallow. Honoria had the door open before they had finished knocking, and was already assessing the child's color and the sound of his breath before the father had finished his sentence. Marcus had doubled back on the road from Wexcombe to retrieve a small ledger he had left in the distillery. He arrived at the house to find the front door open and a lamp burning in the room off the hall, and he stood for a moment in the doorway before he understood what he was looking at. He went in. He did not ask whether he was wanted. He took off his coat and set it on a chair and said simply, "Tell me what to do." Honoria looked at him for one brief moment, and then she said, "The basin. Water from the cold pump, not the kettle. Keep it coming." He kept it coming. He held the basin while she worked, passed her what she asked for without requiring explanation, kept the fire fed at the level she specified, not too high, not too low. And when she needed both hands free, he steadied the child's head without being asked. The fever climbed through the middle hours of the night, and then, somewhere in the small hours before dawn, began to ease. The boy's breathing changed, deepened, steadied, and his color came back in increments, and Honoria sat back on her heels beside the bed and was still. The father was asleep in the chair by the wall. The lamp had burned low. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to show the first gray suggestion of morning. Honoria had been awake for the better part of 20 hours. The guard that she maintained with such precision, the composure that deflected jokes and absorbed cruelties and presented to the world an untroubled surface, had been exhausted by the night's work, spent entirely on the child. She leaned sideways, and her head came to rest against Marcus's shoulder. She was asleep, or nearly asleep, for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she became aware of what she had done, and she straightened, and she did not look at him. Marcus had not moved. He had not turned toward her, or shifted his weight, or made any adjustment that might have woken her before she was ready. He had simply remained where he was, and she had rested there. And now she was upright again and looking at the child's sleeping face. "He will be all right," she said. Marcus answered quietly, "Yes." They sat in the remaining dark until the father stirred, and then Honoria gave her instructions for the morning, and Marcus drove back to Wexcombe in the early light with the sense of a man who has been shown something he will not be able to unsee. He came to the distillery 2 days later. Honoria was at the work table with her back to the door, and she turned when she heard his step. And the expression on her face was the expression of a woman who had been expecting this and had not yet decided how to manage it. "I want to ask you something," Marcus said. He closed the door behind him, not firmly, but deliberately. "I am not asking as a man who was wounded 3 years ago and wants satisfaction. I am asking because I have spent this summer watching you. And I think the answer to my question will tell me something about you that you would prefer I did not know." Honoria set down the jar she was holding. "Why did you refuse me?" he asked. The silence stretched long enough that he heard the wind move through the garden outside. "I had a reason," Honoria said. Her voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of effort rather than ease. "I am not free to give it to you." "Is the reason something that reflects on my character?" Her answer came without hesitation. "No." "Is it something that reflects on yours?" Honoria looked at him directly for the first time since he had entered the room. "You will have to form your own judgment on that." "I have formed it," Marcus said quietly. "I formed it some time ago. I am asking because I want to hear it from you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It had nothing to do with your worth. I want you to know that, because I think you have believed otherwise for 3 years, and that was never the truth. But the reason itself, I cannot give it to you. It belongs to someone else." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. More the look of a man whose suspicion has been confirmed in a way that is both better and worse than he expected. "I see," he said. "I am glad you do," Honoria said. "And now I am asking you to leave." He went. She stood at the work table for a long time after the sound of his horse had faded, her hands flat on the wood, aware that she had told him almost nothing, and he had understood almost everything, and that the distance between those two things was exactly the width of Lavinia's name. At a card evening at Stanbrook the following week, Adelaide delivered her finest performance yet. The room was small, 6 guests, a comfortable fire, the kind of gathering where remarks land without escape. And Adelaide, emboldened by the weeks of distillery visits she had heard about from Francis, turned the conversation with practiced ease toward the subject of Honoria's apparent campaign to recapture a duke who had, she implied, already made his assessment of her and found it wanting. She did not use the word pathetic. She did not need to. The implication moved through the room like smoke. Marcus was at the card table. He watched Adelaide speak, and he watched the room begin to smile. And he did not smile. And his expression was such that the woman beside him shifted very slightly in her chair. He said nothing that evening. He made no public correction. But when the guests departed and the candles were being snuffed, he looked at Adelaide with the particular look of a man who has decided something and is not yet ready to say what it is. Honoria had made her decision before the evening was over. She sent word the following morning canceling the standing arrangement for the village remedies. She declined the next 2 invitations at which Marcus would be present, sending polite notes that offered no explanation. She told herself, in the clear language she used for her own private accounting, that any vindication she could claim ran directly through Lavinia's exposure, and that she had made this choice once before, and she would make it again. She would remain the family's cautionary story. She would remain the woman who had refused a duke and had nothing to show for it. She would remain whatever Adelaide required her to be, because the alternative required her sister to pay a price she had never agreed to pay. It was the right decision. She was almost entirely certain it was the right decision. Lavinia arrived at Stanbrook in the 2nd week of October, visibly in the final weeks of her pregnancy, accompanied by her husband and a quantity of luggage, that suggested she intended to remain for some time before her confinement. She was warm and tired and happy in the way of a woman whose life has arranged itself well. And she embraced her sisters with the uncomplicated affection she had always had more of than the rest of them put together. On her second morning at Stanbrook, she went to the distillery to find Honoria. Honoria was not there. But the cabinet was unlocked. Honoria had been working the previous evening and had not yet returned. And Lavinia, looking for a jar of the dried chamomile she knew her sister kept for her, opened the cabinet and found, on the second shelf, a bundle of letters tied with a piece of plain ribbon. She recognized her own handwriting before she had fully processed what she was looking at. She sat down on the stool beside the work table and untied the ribbon. There were 9 letters. She read 3 of them before she understood fully what she was holding. They were the letters she had written to Marcus before her marriage. Not to Marcus directly. She had never been so reckless. But to Honoria, in the weeks when she was trying to work out what she felt and what she should do, and whether it was wrong to feel it. Letters full of his name, full of what she had observed in him, full of the particular anguish of loving someone you believed you could not have. Honoria had kept them. Honoria had kept them for 3 years, in the cabinet where she kept her most private things, tied with ribbon. Lavinia was still sitting with the letters when Honoria came in from the garden. The 2 women looked at each other across the distillery. "I was looking for chamomile," Lavinia said. Her voice was not quite steady. Honoria closed the door behind her. She crossed the room and sat down on the bench opposite her sister, and she did not say anything for a moment. "I know what you did," Lavinia said. "I have always suspected. I have tried not to suspect. Because if I believed it fully, I would have had to do something about it, and I did not." She stopped. She pressed the letters flat against her lap. "You refused him for me. And then you let us all believe it was your own foolishness. For 3 years. It was a practical decision," Honoria said. "It was not a practical decision. Do not call it that." "Lavinia, I am going to tell them," Lavinia said. "I am going to tell Marcus, and I am going to tell Adelaide and Francis, and I am going to tell anyone who has ever laughed at you for this. I will not. I cannot sit here knowing what you did and allow it to continue." Her voice was firm. "No." She said it without anger, without heat, simply as a fact. "You will not. You cannot stop me. The protection only holds if the silence holds," Honoria said. "If you tell them, you expose yourself to questions you should not have to answer. And you expose your husband to questions he should not have to answer. And you give Adelaide and Francis a story that is far more interesting than the one they have now. I have carried this 3 years without difficulty. I will carry it 3 more. Without difficulty," Lavinia said, and her voice broke. "Lavinia." "Without difficulty," Lavinia repeated. She was weeping now, openly, in the way she had always wept, completely, without pretense, without any attempt to stop. "You have sat in this room for 3 years while Adelaide made a joke of you in front of anyone who would listen, and you sat there and made remarks about chamomile, and you— How can you call that without difficulty?" Honoria moved to sit beside her sister on the stool. She took both of Lavinia's hands in hers, and she held them, and she did not say anything else, and she did not weep. She simply held her sister's hands until the weeping was done. That afternoon, Marcus found Honoria on the churchyard path. He had come specifically. He had ridden to Stanbrook and asked for her, and been told she had gone out walking, and he had followed the path he knew she used. He found her near the old yew at the far end of the churchyard, standing with her hands clasped, looking at nothing in particular. "I am not here to press you for the answer," he said. I want to say something, and I would like you to hear it." Honoria turned to face him. "I believe," Marcus said carefully, "that the reason you refused me 3 years ago was not yours. That it belonged, as you said, to someone else, and that you chose to carry the consequence of it in silence, rather than give that person's name. And I believe that the silence cost you considerably more than you have ever allowed anyone to see." He paused. "I am not asking you to confirm this. I will not ask again. Whatever the reason was, I intend to carry it to my grave without speaking of it. And I give you my word on that now, without conditions." Honoria was very still. "I am asking to court you," Marcus said. "Not in spite of what you did, but because of what it showed me about who you are. I have spent this summer in your company, and I have not found a single moment in which you were less than the most honest and capable person in the room. I should have seen that 3 years ago. I did not." He met her eyes. "I am seeing it now." The churchyard was quiet around them, the October light flat and pale, the yew very dark against the sky. Honoria stood for a moment in the silence of everything she had held for 3 years. The weight of it, the habit of it, the way she had learned to breathe around it. And then she stepped forward and kissed him. Once. Slowly. Her hands were at her sides, and his were at his. And it was not gratitude, and it was not relief. It was a beginning, deliberate and chosen, made by a woman who had not chosen for herself in a very long time. She stepped back. She looked at him steadily. She held his gaze. "Yes." Then she turned and walked back along the path toward the house, and he stood in the churchyard for a moment before he followed. The Stanbrook dinner in the 3rd week of October was a proper autumn gathering. 12 guests, candlelight, the table set with the good china that came out for occasions the household considered worth the trouble. Lavinia was present, seated beside her husband, her confinement close enough that she moved carefully, and had been given the chair nearest the fire. Marcus was among the guests. Adelaide and Frances were at their places with the ease of women on familiar ground. The first course had been cleared, and the second was being laid when Adelaide, with the instinct of someone who had read the room correctly and found it receptive, turned to the guest on her left and said, with the warmth of a woman sharing a treasured family story, "You must ask Honoria to tell you about the Duke she refused. We have always said it is the great mystery of the county. What woman, in her right mind, turns down a perfectly good Duke and then wonders why she is still at home tending herbs at her age?" The table moved toward laughter. Several guests glanced toward Honoria with the indulgent curiosity that Adelaide's performances always produced. Marcus set down his glass. The sound of it was quiet, the small click of crystal on linen. But something in the deliberateness of it drew a fraction of the table's attention, and into that fraction of silence he spoke. 3 years ago, he said, without raising his voice, I proposed marriage to Lady Honoria Calvert. He was not looking at Adelaide. He was looking at the table in general, at the assembled guests, with the calm of a man who has decided exactly what he intends to say. She refused me. She offered no explanation, and I spent 3 years assuming the explanation was a poor opinion of my character or my worth. He paused. I was wrong. The refusal reflected more credit on her than I was capable of understanding at the time, and more credit on her than I deserved. I have regretted every day since that I was not worth the word no. The table was entirely silent. Marcus turned to Honoria directly, in front of every person who had ever laughed at the joke. I am asking whether you will permit me to court you properly, he said. Here, now, so that there is no ambiguity about where I stand." Adelaide opened her mouth. She closed it again. Before Honoria could speak, Lavinia stood. She did not stand quickly. She was too far along for that. But she stood with a deliberateness that brought every eye in the room to her. Her face was wet. She had not tried to stop the tears, and she did not try now. "My eldest sister," Lavinia said, "is the finest woman I have ever known." Her voice was steady despite the tears, the voice of someone saying something she has been waiting to say for a long time. Every person at this table who has laughed at her expense should be deeply ashamed of themselves. She looked at Adelaide. She looked at Frances. She sat back down. The room was very quiet. Adelaide looked at her plate. Frances looked at the candle. The guest on Adelaide's left discovered something requiring his attention in the middle distance. Honoria sat for a moment in the silence of it. The silence of 3 years of jokes, absorbed and deflected and set aside, meeting at last the silence of a room that had nothing left to say. She turned to the table. Her voice, when she spoke, had the same dry composure that had held her upright through every afternoon in this room for 3 years. "I have never once regretted my refusal," she said. "Not for a single day." Then she turned to Marcus. She met his eyes across the table. "Yes." He courted her as he had asked to, without haste and without pretense. He came to Stanbrook on Tuesday mornings and walked with her on her rounds to the village, learning the names of the families she visited and the particular nature of each ailment and the specific preparation she used and why. He asked questions that were genuinely curious, and she answered them with the unself-conscious thoroughness of someone who had not often been asked. He learned that she had been tending the village since her father's death 7 years ago, that she had built the distillery herself from a storage room, that she knew the name of every child in a 3-mile radius and could tell you which ones were prone to chest complaints and which ones were prone to eating things they should not. They walked the churchyard path in the October cold, their breath visible in the morning air. They worked in the distillery on late afternoons, the lamp low, her specimens spread between them on the table, his handwriting beginning to appear in the margins of her cataloging notes, where she had asked him to record a measurement. The conversations were long and unguarded in the way that conversations become when both parties have stopped managing their impressions of each other. One evening, the work was set aside and was not resumed. The kitchen garden at first light was still and cold, the herb beds cut back to their winter shapes, frost on the grass catching the pale early sun. 2 cups of tea sat on a single tray beside the distillery door, steam rising from both. On the work table inside, a new ledger lay open, not of ailments and remedies, not of the village's small sufferings and their small reliefs, but of an estate, a shared one. The first page was written in her hand, the entries precise and clear, beginning at the beginning, as a woman who had learned to keep her own accounts would begin, with what was there, what was needed, and what, at last, could be built.